go and put these things onto controllers now. Now you don't have to do this. You could go off and sequence this stuff now. You don't need to go and set up your controllers, but I do want to go to the controller tab so you can get a feeling for things like start channels. By default, xLights has been managing these things and making sure that things don't overlap. There is something up here in the tools menu called check sequence. This is something that you want to run often, because what it does is this. What it does is it actually does a scan through of my layout and identifies any issues with my layout. So it's highlighted a whole bunch of errors here where I've got some models which are not configured onto a controller. It's actually told me that I got this wrong. My 384 does not actually divide evenly into 384. It divides into 378. So I probably should set this tree here to be 378 nodes to fix that. It's also spotted that my model groups at the moment have no models in them, which is not a great thing, and so we probably want to do something about that as well. So yeah, this will find a whole bunch of very detailed problems that will often cause you issues down the track. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be clean. Errors you probably want to fix. Those things are generally, there's no good reason for them to be true, but you may also get some warnings, and the warnings you can generally ignore if you understand what they are and you're comfortable with them. So let's go to our whole house group here, and let's add our models into our whole house group, because we deleted all the models that were there, and we can easily do that just by shift clicking, holding all of these things and dragging them all across, and now all of those things are in my whole house group. Now if you look closely at the whole house group here, there's this red cross which is kind of hard to see. And in fact, if I click in my layout here, one of the things I can do here is set the transparency or brightness of this image. And so if I set this image down to, I don't know, 30%, that dims out the house substantially. And when I click on my whole house group now, you can see that there's this red cross here, which represents the center of my whole house group. And so it's been pulled somewhat to the right because of these arches all the way over here, and the house actually ends over here. And so one of the things that I might want to do, for instance, is move that center onto the tree, because visually I would like the center of any effects to be the center of the tree, even though it's not technically the center of the group. And you can play with this center offset here to move that around. Now it uses a fairly large scale, so I'm probably going to want to set that to something like -300, and that's a little bit far. Maybe -250. That's getting closer. Maybe -230, still too far. 220. That's very close. Again, I can spend time, but now the center of the group has been determined to be here. So now if I drop an effect that has a center, that center of the effect will actually be on the middle of my tree, which is where I'd like it to be. And you can do that with each and every group. You can set the center points that you want to use. Most of the time the default will be fine, but every now and then you'll find a group where actually it makes sense to set that center to be somewhere special. All right, let's go to our controller tab. So our controller tab is where we talk about our controllers that are going to run our lights. Now we do not need to set this up until we have our controllers and we want to actually start controlling the lights. And that may not be for months and months and months. And if that's the case, then you can just ignore this tab and you can immediately go off and start sequencing and doing stuff on this layout. You don't need to set the controller tab up to do any of that sort of stuff. You can use xLights and have an xLights show in your imagination for years and do everything bar actually driving any lights, and there's not a problem with that. But when you do come time to set your controllers up, then you are going to want to come into this tab here and start adding your controllers. Now most controllers or most Pixel controllers are Ethernet based controllers, and so you're going to be clicking on this Add Ethernet. If you are going to be using your computer to run something like a Lightorama or a Renard or something, you're going to want to add a USB, because you're going to plug a dongle into your computer and you're going to control your lights over that, and so you use that Add USB. If you're still planning to use a Renard or a Lightorama, but you plan to hang that off your Pi or hang that off your Falcon or hang that off your J1 Sys or your Avitec or whatever other controller you might have, then you're not going to want to use Add USB, because those things will be actually included in your Ethernet controller. The controller that xLights is talking to is what gets added here, not the eventual controller that you're going to be controlling. So to add a controller, it's really literally as simple as clicking Add Ethernet. Now, if your controllers are plugged in on your network, you can try clicking the Discover button, and xLights will go out into the network and, using a variety of techniques, will attempt to find your controllers. Now, I didn't turn my controllers on here before I started, so we're just going to add an Ethernet here and do it manually. But Discover will go and find things that are on your network. First thing you want to do is you want to give your controller a name. And typically I would name my controllers according to where I've located them or what they're controlling. So this might be my garage controller, for instance. You're then going to want to set its active status. Generally speaking, things are just active. Every now and then you'll have a controller that you want to control from xLights, but maybe when you're running in the show, you're not going to want your show player to drive it directly, because maybe it's going to be in remote mode or something, and then you might use xLights only. But for now, active is fine. In description, you can put anything you like. Anything that's useful to you, you can put into the description. xLights doesn't care. Then you would typically choose the vendor of the controller. So here you would choose one of these many vendors. Now, if there are vendors missing that we need to add, we have no problem with adding those vendors, but we need to understand details about the controller, and we don't have access to every controller on the planet. We have lots of controllers, and I got a board full of them that I use for testing, but I don't have everything. So you might come in here and you might choose a Falcon controller as your vendor. You will then need to choose the vendor or the model of the controller, and you can choose from one of numerous ones. So let's just use an F16V3 here. And then there's a variant property here where you get to say whether there are expansion boards or not. And for the moment, let's not do that. You're then going to want to give it an IP address. So you're going to give it an IP address like so, that you're going to be talking to that controller over. Now, this controller is actually right here, so I can turn this one on. And the protocol that you're going to want to use. Now, the Falcon controllers support a number of different protocols. Most commonly, people use E131. The DDP is relatively new on these controllers. You could go that way as well. It's a little bit more efficient than E131. ArtNet is a protocol that is mostly used in the professional lighting industry. Most hobbyists don't bother with it. It's actually slightly more efficient than E131 in terms of space, but it's missing some features that E131 has, although most people don't use those features on E131. But this hobby has grown up with E131, so that's what most people will use. ZCPP is a protocol that's that we invented to try and simplify things even further, but due to the Falcon Pi player not supporting it, it's generally only useful if you're going to stick with something like xSchedule to play your show. If you're going to use the Pi, you're going to need to use E131 or DDP or ArtNet. The only other things, now because we're using E131 here, you need to worry about things like universes and counts of universes and things like that. In the case of a controller, I would generally recommend you choose a nice round number like 100 as the starting universe, and then if I had another controller, I'd say 200 as the starting universe, and that just keeps things nice and clean. Very few controllers today support more than 100 universes. I think the V4 of the Falcon will support almost 200, so maybe you need to start going up by 200s. But yeah, it actually doesn't matter if you overlap universes on controllers. The other thing that I would generally do is I would turn on auto layout models, auto size, and full xLights control. Unless you get yourself into a situation where you really need to do things manually, experience in 2020 has shown us that the vast majority of people can go with their fully automated scenario and it just works, and it makes their life so much easier. Because when you go this way, you no longer have to worry about universes and start channels and all that sort of stuff. xLights will just deal with it for you, and because you're going to be using the upload down here to configure your controllers, you actually never have to deal with that sort of stuff. And so I would generally recommend people go that way unless they find themselves in a situation where they can't. Okay, so having done that, that's pretty much all you need to do here in terms of configuring a controller. The next thing you need to do is use the visualizer to actually lay things out. And the visualizer is a really easy to use visual tool that enables me to take all of my models over here and map them onto my controller ports. Now, we said it was an F16V3, so that means it has 16 ports here and it has 4 serial ports that I could use to put my DMX props onto or my law controllers onto, etc. And the way you do this is you basically need to know, well, where are things going to be? So take my tree. So I've got a bunch of trees here. So take my first tree. Let's say I want to put that onto port 1. It's 378 pixels and it's now associated with port 1. And that's all you have to do. If tree 2, let's say I want to put tree 2 on a separate port. Oh, tree 2's interesting. Tree 2's got a whole bunch of extra strings and this thing's gone red and it's ugly, right? And the reason that's happened is because I set this up with 16 strings. And so 16 strings, xLights is reading as 16 ports on the controller. So that's a bit of a problem. I'm going to have to do something about that. If I go to tree 5 is that big pixel tree where I said it was 4 strings of 600. And so you can see that xLights here has recognized that that's okay. It's going to zigzag up and down 4 times, but that's okay. Everything's good. Now I can also go and take my star here and put it at the end of my 4th string. And now it's put 720 pixels onto the 5th port, and I can now hook my star up onto the end of that last string on the tree and everything will be good. It will configure the controller like that. Now, this is not infinitely flexible. For instance, there is no easy way for me to decide on the 4th string that this star should actually be before the 4th string of the tree. That's not doable using the visualizer. It's possible to configure xLights that way, but you're now in manual configuration territory and you probably don't want to be there. So, this is another one of those reasons why you want to set your models up in xLights first so that you understand how xLights works and optimize your build to work effectively with xLights and save yourself a bunch of time. Now, I'm going to quickly go back to out of here and back to my layout here, and I had this set up as 1, 378 and 18. So 1, 378 and 18 and 1, 378 and 18. Oh, actually, oh no, it did save. Sometimes when you're editing these properties, if you don't press tab or enter, the property doesn't actually stick and you have to go back and redo it. So just be wary of that one. It does happen. All right, so we go back into the visualizer now. We can grab these trees and we can do things like we can daisy chain them together. So we can say all of those trees are actually on one output, but they're all chained together. Oh, that's okay. That didn't take. Notice how tree 4 didn't take properly. So let's go back to the layout. Oh, string 4 is this one here. I didn't do this one. 1, 378 and 18. Go back to our controllers, go back to the visualizer. There it is, all in there. But we have a problem. We have 1512 pixels on this port, and the Falcon does not support 1512. It actually only supports 1024, which this error down here nicely tells me. So I can come up here and move some things around to fix that problem and move them onto a separate port. And it's literally as easy as drag and drop. This is, yeah, gone are the days where you have to set hundreds of different properties and remember what you've done, etc. It really is as simple as dragging, dropping things around. So at this point, everything's laid out. There's no redness here. There's no errors down here. It's probably pretty good. Not guaranteed that it's pretty good, but it's probably pretty good. And so the next thing you want to do is you want to upload to the controller. Channels per universe, Scott. Look, 510, 512, you definitely don't want to have any other number, but either one is fine. The Falcon doesn't really care. It will cope quite happily with either. Okay, so now if I double click on this controller, it will try and open that controller up in my browser, which may or may not work. I don't think it's going to work because I don't think I set my... No, I haven't set that controller up that way. So I actually can't upload it. But at this point, if I had that controller online, I could do an upload input, upload output. Now I've linked them together, so it doesn't really matter which one I do. I can do either and it will just work. If you haven't linked them together, you should upload the inputs and then upload the outputs. And that will configure the controller to match xLights. And that's all you have to do. You never actually have to log onto your controller at all to configure things and get things running. At that point, everything should work just fine. And at that point, you can go to things like Tools Test, and you can come over here to Models. I like to use the alternate here, which will just turn on alternate channels, so it will typically flash green and pink, and then you just come in and click on your particular model, and off it goes, and it will try to drive those pixels, and you'll see whether you've got everything configured correctly. And it really is as easy as that to set up. Now, don't get me wrong, you will have issues, and you know, it will take you time to get this thing configured. Now, I haven't talked about things like fancy network setups where you've got a Pi player and you've got the Pi player acting as a proxy for xLights to talk to your controller. All of that sort of stuff is things that you will probably need to worry about sometime this year. But right now, just to get your lights going the first time, you don't really need to go there. You know, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on show players in this presentation either, because again, that is something that you will be able to deal with over the course of the year. It's not something you need to focus on day one.
Can you point to the default brightness right there, Keith, since we had a question in chat regarding default brightness, and it's right there?
So default brightness here, I think it's only available at the moment on the Falcon controllers, but essentially you can come in here and set it to 30%, and what will happen is xLights will by default configure everything at 30% brightness. Now you can override it on the prop. So if you're in the visualizer and say, well, actually these arches here, they're sitting inside PEX tubing and the tubing hides all the light. So I need this at 100%. So I can come in here and say, I want to force the brightness to be 100%. But, you know, generally speaking, you don't need to set the brightness on these things, and these things will all default to 30%, including all of the unused ports. And that way, when you plug in lights into the controller, you're less likely to overload the controller and blow a fuse, which can happen if you plug too many pixels into a controller and you don't have appropriate power injection. So yeah, that's what default brightness will do. Other controllers will allow brightness. You can set the brightness and upload it. There's just not a default brightness for other controllers. You actually have to physically go into each prop and configure it. Within the visualizer, there are a bunch of things that you could do in here to configure props. So things like smart remotes, and we won't go into smart remotes today. It's a more advanced topic, but you can do things like lay things out across various remotes. You can set brightnesses and the like. I will quickly go back, and let me quickly go back and create that 8-segment AC arch so you can see how to do that. So remember, we set this to 8, we set this to 20, and we set the string properties to be single color, and let's set it to white. Okay, and while we're at it, right, let's do something. Let's go and grab a reindeer model here. Do we have a reindeer? Oh no, nativity scene. Let's grab a Mary, that'll do. All right, so here's a Mary, but let's imagine that this is actually not not pixels. This is actually an AC prop. Maybe it's just a set of white pixels. So what I want to do is I need to come into the model data here, and these numbers in here are all going up from 1 to 50 or however far it goes. The first thing I need to do is right click here and make this a single node. So if I click that, all the numbers in here change to ones. So that means everything is now a single channel. So I click OK. I change again this from RGB nodes to be single channel, single color. Let's set it again to white. Right, and now it's set up as a single channel. It uses just a single channel and will all turn on. And so now I've got these two props, and let's imagine I'm going to attach those to a Lightorama controller. So I will come into my controller tab again. I'm going to click on visualize. I'll come down. Now we should use Lightorama. We'll put it onto serial port 2. And let's imagine I have my archers and I have my Mary. Now notice that this is using 8 channels because it's an 8-segment arch, so I'd expect it to be using 8 channels, and my Mary's using a single channel. These are set up as if they're on my Lightorama Unit 1, but let's imagine they were on Unit 2, in which case we need to come in here and set this channel to be 17. Okay, in which case this is now on 17, but the problem is actually that's a problem. We actually needed to, we actually need to set this and chain it. So we set that to 17. So this is now channel 17 through to 24, and then 25 is my Mary. So these are on Unit 2 in my Lightorama universe. So that's how you set up your AC props to be run off the serial port on your Falcon controller. Now, equally, if I was controlling them off a local USB connection, I would just add a USB in here. I would come in here and let's call this my lore box. Now, for simple, up to 96 channels of lore, I would just do it this way, and you can either set it as DMX or the lore protocol. It's up to you. That's all you need to do there. I do need to set the vendor. The vendor is lore. Now the setting, this is a little bit funky, but you need to set it if you want to access the visualizer. And so now I can come in here. I do need to. Okay, so there's a couple of challenges I have here, and that is my channels need to be defined so that they are on my Lightorama controller, and that's going to require me to come back to here and change them from the garage controller, and I'm going to have to move them back to using a start channel. So it gets very messy at this point. This is one of those things that we just need to do better. Unfortunately, we're not there yet with making this stuff really simple. So I'm just going to set the controller here to be the Lightorama controller, and that way when I go back to the visualizer here, they will be here, and I can set them onto the appropriate serial port, and now they're configured for that for that Lightorama controller. And now obviously I would need to plug that dongle in and collect my Lightorama controller directly to the PC, but that's how you'd set that up in that circumstance.
And if we want to add an Arduino or something similar to that, we can add on top of it, or we cannot combine that with this kind of...
So if you want to add an Arduino would typically be a similar USB, but most people are using, for an Arduino, they would be using the DMX protocol, or maybe the Renard protocol, but you would need to clear the vendor in that circumstance, because we don't really define those things, at which time you have access to things like the Renard protocol, etc., and you can set the speed, which is typically 57,600 for Renard, and that's how you could hang your Arduino or something off it. Now, if you had your Arduino with an Ethernet shield, then you would obviously add it as an Ethernet controller. And if you were adding something like a ESP8266, you would add an Ethernet controller as well. And with those ones, we actually do have the most common firmware being WLED and the Pixel Stick firmware. I have to say, and look, I've done this, I have run Pixels off Arduinos. It is a hard way to go. I would generally not recommend it for newbies. I know it looks cheap and attractive, but if you plan to run anything more than a few things, you're invariably going to spend more money going that path and have a lot more frustration. I would definitely, if I was using that, go to do-it-yourself Christmas. There's a lot more people that are more likely to be doing that sort of configuration over there.
Actually, this year I used Vixen. I started with Vixen this year, and I used Arduino to build one LED matrix, and I ran with that. So I'm just thinking that if I want to make use of those Arduino, which I already had earlier, so if I want to make use of them, whether there's a way we can combine that with other controllers.
Well, yeah, like I say, you can. You just need to add in the USB in here, and you need to set the appropriate protocol that controller is listening to, right? Whatever it happens to be. Choose your protocol. It depends on the firmware that you've loaded on the Arduino. Arduinos don't have one firmware. There's lots of different sketches out there. You need to choose the one that works with your sketch.
Yeah.
Or choose a different sketch.
Hey Keith, what if I'm using a long-range receiver with this Falcon? How do I define that using the visualizer?
Okay, so if you were using a receiver board, now obviously this is a Falcon 16, so there aren't really, but it's literally as simple as coming down here and choosing the receiver that you've got it on. Now, if you're using it on a dumb receiver, you don't need to set anything here. Just leave it as none, and you know, obviously you'd be choosing a port that had a bunch of receivers hanging off it. If you're using smart receivers, then you choose A, B, or C, and you know, for multi-string models, you might want to have it flow across different receivers and so forth, and you can do that using these settings here. But again, I don't really want to delve deeply into that. It's not really a beginner topic, but that's how you do it.
I've got a quick one for you, Keith.
Yeah.
Would you be able to go into just a small amount of detail on why it is a better idea to use the FPP proxy in the controllers tab as opposed to setting up static routing, given that there are probably people who are, you know, looking at setting up pies and whatnot, not necessarily an in-depth, but, you know, so as they don't, if you look at your Google search for how to set them up, a lot of the older information still mentions static routing and confuses quite a lot of people.
So the static routing obviously predates as a solution before the Pi added the ability to proxy. The Pi proxy, really the only advantage to the Pi proxy stuff is it's simpler to set up, it's more standardized, it's independent of operating system and network infrastructure and everything else, and that's why people tend to gravitate towards it. That being said, there are disadvantages to the FPP proxy. The FPP proxy is somewhat aware of and intercepts the traffic that flows backwards and forwards, and consequently, you know, things like SAN devices don't work through the FPP proxy because there's issues with the way in which the SAN devices talks to the browser that FPP can't deal with. And so FPP proxy is not necessarily better. Again, it's one of these things, right? When anyone comes in and says, oh, FPP proxy is better, yes, but only in certain circumstances given a certain set of constraints. It's definitely simpler to set up. It's less complex in a lot of scenarios, but it doesn't support every scenario. And so there are scenarios where setting up an actual network route will actually make your life a lot easier. There are situations where setting that route up on the PC makes sense, but there are other situations where you really want to be setting that route up on your network switch or router, because you want to be able to route that traffic from devices where you don't want to have to set up a static route on every single device. So it's not a case of one thing is necessarily better than the other. You need to actually dig into and understand the types of scenarios that you're trying to support. And I really bristle at people that suggest that this is necessarily better, because it's better in some circumstances but not better in others. And like I said, I don't really want to get into the whole FTP proxy, etc. There's a whole separate topic on network setup and structure and the best for certain scenarios and so forth.